Hi everyone, my name is Mitch Handley from Inventory Hive, and I want to thank everyone today who's registered for today's webinar between Inventory Hive and our industry partners, the TDS. We've had over 200 people registered for today's webinar, so I just want to thank every single one of you who's registered for today. And yeah, we do appreciate the support. Obviously, our partners, the TDS, we try and do these informative webinars, more educational pieces as well, just to make sure you're creating good inventory reports, which we'll be covering off today with enhanced features, but also making sure you're getting accurate and fair deposit deductions as well. If you do have any questions, myself and Sandy have set aside 10-15 minutes at the end of today's webinar to answer any questions you have. So if you do have any questions you want answering about today's webinar or anything like that about disputes or inventories, on the right hand side, I think might be the opposite way because I'm looking at the camera. There should be a question box, so if you put your questions in there, they'll come through to me, and I'll look through those as we go through the webinar, and we'll answer those towards the end. Before I get started on my slides, Sandy, do you want to introduce yourself? And thanks for joining us today. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining. So my name is Sandy Bastin, and I'm Director of Resolution at TDS. So I'm responsible for the early resolution and self-resolution process and the evidence gathering, and then also for a team of adjudicators who issue decisions should the dispute not be resolved early and it needs a full adjudication.
Brilliant stuff. And for those that don't know me, I'm Mitch from Inventory Hive. I'm the marketing manager here, and what we do is provide inventory software to letting agents, landlords, inventory clerk companies, student accommodation, universities, etc., so they can create detailed property inspection reports. So today's webinar is about enhancing your inventory reports with a new feature we've just released on Inventory Hive called Smart Fill. So we're running through that today, as well as other things you should be including in inventory reports and why, such as tenant feedback and creating a robust checkout report as well. And then I'll hand over to Sandy, who will talk about deposit deductions and some case studies as well on today's webinar. So yeah, let's get started. So for those that aren't aware, in July, we released a new feature called Smart Fill, and this was based on feedback from inventory clerks, property managers, letting agents who, when creating reports, they wanted to create a detailed description of items in the report based on the condition cleanliness rating that they put in their reports effectively. So we introduced a feature called Smart Fill, which essentially when you rate a condition cleanliness rating of an item, you can hit a button, it will populate a detailed description in the description box below, and that will get embedded in your report. The whole point of this feature is obviously it helps automatically populate the condition cleanliness description based off the rating of that room or item. So the example on the screen here, the front door. It helps save time, so it helps increase efficiency and convenient for completing reports. So it saves you having to type all of these out. But the main thing about this feature we've introduced is it helps enhance your reports as well. So I'm sure Sandy will vouch for this as well, is that sometimes when inventory reports or checkout reports get sent to adjudicators, there's not enough description or detail in them. So what happens is that because there's not enough detail, then obviously it doesn't help with a dispute resolution. So a detailed description that we help populate in for you is crucial for a dispute resolution. So it helps inventory clerks and property inspectors quickly capture key information in a deposit dispute case. So how can it help with an adjudication? Obviously, Sandy will come on to this more in later on, and I've got an example report on the right hand side where the Smart Fill descriptions have been used. But it helps create a detailed check-in and check-out, and it's crucial for end of tenancy deposit deduction proposals. So your check-in and check-out report are probably one of the most important pieces of evidence that gets submitted to an adjudicator or your deposit scheme, whether it's a TDS or someone else. And the description that you populate on those reports is really important. The Smart Fill feature actually enhances that by providing a thorough description of the property's cleanliness and condition, and it helps increase the detail and helps parties agree on proposed deductions afterwards without the need of an adjudication as well. If you've got that detail in your report ready, like the example on the right hand side, and that will help the tenant know what to expect at checkout as well. So that will reduce the chance of any proposed deductions and need for an adjudication at checkout as well. If you've just got a blank report with just a quick rating of good or fair, for example, with no description, then obviously that's open for interpretation. It can create a lot of confusion at checkout, and then you'll have a lot of turn and through between the landlord, agent, and tenant on what should be a deduction or any deductions from the deposit. And also what we recommend as well, and I'll come on to this later on, is that tenants can comment on the findings of your report as well. Again, I'll come on to that later on, but it helps add further context to your reports as well. So although you've created a detailed report yourself, the tenant adding further comment to that will help enhance your reports as well. How does the Smart Fill feature work? So you can use it on desktop or the Inventory Hive app. So all you simply do is rate the condition cleanliness rating of an item. So if you choose the radiators fair and poor, hit the Smart Fill button and it'll populate a detailed description in for you ready. Don't worry, you can still free type and voice dictate, etc. as well. But what it does, it helps get a good base description in ready for you. So if I just change it to good and fair, for example, it will populate a good description and a fair cleanliness in there for you. You still got the option to choose from the drop down menu like discolored, stains, scratches, etc. You can still free type as mentioned, but the whole point of the Smart Fill button is to help get a good detailed condition cleanliness description from the outset at a click of a button. Once you've populated that in, you move on to the next item. So if I just go to sockets and switches, if I just choose very poor condition cleanliness for the example, hit Smart Fill, again, you've got a detailed description in your report ready, which helps adjudicators and tenants and landlords when it comes to checkout. It helps drastically speed up your reporting time, and you don't need a signal as well when using the Smart Fill feature. So that is an added bonus. Also, when creating your reports as well, and you've populated the condition cleanliness description, it's important to evidence that with photos for a number of reasons. So there's the visual evidence. So photos provide a clear and objective proof of the property's condition at the time of the report. So although you might have taken, although you might have said the condition of the wall, for example, was in a good condition, no scratches or marks or anything like that, evidence that with a photo helps further back that up. But adding to that as well is that it shows the color. The photo might show the color of the wall. There's no picture hooks present or anything like that. So although you might not describe that in the condition cleanliness box description, the photo also supports that and just adds additional further evidence to that as well. It helps capture specific details like wear, damage, cleanliness that might be missed from the written descriptions, as I've just mentioned. Helps with dispute resolution. So it's essential, and I'm sure Sandy will agree as well, that photos are essential for supporting claims in deposit disputes, offering undeniable visual records. So if you've outlined the condition cleanliness of a room or item and you've supported that with a photo, then it's all outlined there. And adding to that, all photos that are captured through the Inventory Hive app that are added to the report are date and time stamped as well to further back that up. So, for example, if someone uploaded an old photograph, for an example, it would populate the date of when that photo was taken, whether it was 6 months or a year ago. So, using up-to-date photos and capturing those through the app show it's date and time stamped, and it's clear for transparency as well. So it ensures both tenants and landlords have a clear understanding of the property state, reducing from misunderstandings at checkout as well. I'm just going to come on to tenant feedback now, and this is something we're really strong advocates at Inventory Hive. So for those that aren't aware, Inventory Hive was actually founded by our director and CEO, Richard Abbott's. He was a tenant himself. He had a bad experience when he moved out of property once because he basically got an inventory on the back of a cigarette packet and he wasn't allowed to provide feedback on the original check-in. So then when he moved out the property, there was lots of deductions from his deposit, lots of maintenance issues, etc. But they were there when they moved in. But because he wasn't allowed an opportunity to do that, then he couldn't add those comments to the report, and then those issues couldn't be fixed during the tenancy. There are a number of reasons why some agents or landlords or inventory clerks don't allow for tenant feedback. So you've got too much administration time, which is understandable. You might outsource your inventories to an inventory clerk company who doesn't communicate for the tenant with whatever reason. Their sole job might be just to go to the property and create the reports and send them back to the agent or landlord for them to sort out afterwards. Also, agents and landlords might worry about not getting the report signed off. So I'm sure this might be a question later on that might come through, whether a report stands up if it's got a signature or not. But agents or landlords do worry about not getting a report signed off, so they tend to print off a copy, take it straight to the tenant and get them to sign for it straight away while the furniture van's outside getting all the furniture in while they're trying to move in. But also, agents and landlords feel that the tenant feeding back on the report is negative or critical, which again we understand, but as I'll come on to in a second, they're actually adding more evidence to reports, so they're not actually criticising your report, but it is understandable why people might feel that. So why should agents, landlords allow for tenant feedback on the report? So drastically reduces the chance of a dispute at checkout. So allowing your tenant to feedback on the report at check-in means that they can raise any maintenance issues that the inventory clerk or property inspector might have missed, any problems that might have been missed. For example, they might have moved in and realised the oven doesn't work or the shower doesn't have hot water. So allowing the tenant to do that reduces the chance of a dispute at checkout, because then when it does come to a checkout, they can't say it was like that when I moved in, when they've had opportunity to add comments onto the report. Something I think is quite good as well is it helps create a positive agent, landlord and tenant relationship from the start. So allowing your tenant to feedback on the report shows that you're engaging, you're educating the tenant on what the property needs to be at checkout, and it shows that you're working with them to make sure the inventory is correct from the very start, again reducing any issues at checkout. It's an opportunity for the tenant to raise any issues that might have accidentally been missed, and I think the key word here is accidentally. So obviously people might have missed something by accident, like an inventory clerk might have missed off a stain on the carpet, for example, and allowing the tenant to add that in just helps add more evidence and solidifies that report from the outset. Raise maintenance issues as well, like I mentioned about maybe the oven doesn't work, so that issue can be fixed straight away from the outset, and then that can be fixed for the remainder of the tenancy and working as normal. You can also capture signatures digitally without the need to be present. So often it's time consuming for an agent or a landlord to print off the report, travel to the property, wherever that might be, and stand there with the tenant and get them to sign for it with a pen and paper. Whereas you can issue that report to them digitally via email, and they can sign for it remotely from the comfort of the office or home. And then because of that, allowing for tenant feedback allows you to create a robust side-by-side comparative checkout as well. So you can see the tenant's comments on the checkout report, so you know that you can't make any deductions if it's already been raised by the tenant. So how can the tenant feedback on the report? So this is an example on the right-hand side. They can get sent documents like gas safety, rent guide, EPC. What the tenant can then do is they get a fixed period, which is typically 7 days, to move in and provide feedback on the report. I think the industry standard is usually 7 days, but you can change it to whatever you feel is suitable for you. And what the tenant does is during that 7-day period is get moved into the property, get settled in. They're not under pressure because the landlord or agents or inventory clerks stood there with the report saying, quick sign it. The tenant's got their own time to get settled in. They might not realise until day 3 or 4 that the shower doesn't work or there's a problem in the garden. They can view the photos digitally as well, and 360 photos, so they can see, for example, all of the lights working, the colour of the walls, etc. So they know exactly what the properties look like. And then they go through the report, look at the condition, cleanliness, description and rating. And then if they're happy with that description, they leave the answer to the question as yes, they're happy with that. But if they do want to provide feedback, then the tenant's encouraged to do that. So, for example, if they go into the dining room, for example, and realise the inspector said that the wall was free of mark stains and scratches, etc. Where if the tenant notices a scratch or dint, they can type that onto the report and then evidence that with a photo. And the key thing about this is then that gets slotted into the check-in report. It's all audit trailed nice and neatly, and then it can all be managed from there. Good thing about this, it helps minimize excessive back and forth email communications as well. And it's good for the tenant as well because they understand the tenant feedback on the report helps provide additional evidence and it's not criticism. So this is an example of a check-in report with tenant feedback with the example of the walls, if you can see at the bottom. So you've got the condition cleanliness rating of each item and description, nice and detailed report with the photos, and then you've got the tenant feedback, all audit trailed in the report as well. So when that does get sent to Sandy's team for resolution or adjudication, they can clearly see what that was like. The next step, excuse me, the next step is then once you've got your detailed check-in report, it helps you create a robust side-by-side comparative checkout report. The key thing is that for a good checkout report is that you need a really, really good check-in. So make sure you put time in the check-in to make sure you've got an easier and smoother checkout. Make sure you're specific about the condition cleanliness of the property, like using the smart fill feature, for example, and that helps Sandy and the team at the TDS or any deposit scheme to clearly understand what the condition cleanliness of that property. When doing your check-in and check-outs as well, don't forget what you can't see, such as damp and mold or smell of stuff as well. So sometimes you might realise like behind the sofa or anything like that, or in a inbuilt wardrobe, you can get damp and mold in those places as well. So make sure you detail stuff that what you can't see as well. And I suppose the key thing about creating a good checkout report is not just the check-in, is don't waste your time on the wrong details or what doesn't need to be raised. So on your checkout report, all adjudicators or landlords or tenants are really interested in are any deposit deductions, maintenance issues, or any significant changes. So if the condition cleanliness of a specific item, let's say the carpet or the dining table is as expected at checkout, there's really no need to include that in your checkout report. It's only stuff where there's significant changes from check-in that you want to raise for dispute or deduction from the deposit, any maintenance issues or any significant changes. And that sums up my PowerPoint today, and I'll hand over to Sandy in a second. For those wanting to learn more about Inventory Hive, if you just drop me an email at info@inventoryhive.co.uk and we can show you how Inventory Hive works. And yeah, I'm going to pass over to Sandy.
Lovely, thanks very much, Mitch. Okay, so I think I've done my introduction, so if we can move on to the next slide. So just for those of you who don't know very much about TDS, so we are the UK's longest running government approved tenancy deposit protection scheme. So we have a dual role. So we're here to enable you to comply with the legislation, agents and landlords to comply. So we can protect your deposits in either an insured scheme where there's a low fee, or a custodial scheme where it's free to use. In the insured scheme, you hold the deposit throughout the duration of the tenancy. In the custodial scheme, the deposit is to be sent to TDS and we will hold it throughout the tenancy. Secondly, under the legislation, we are to provide a free alternative dispute resolution service at the end of a tenancy in the event that parties are unable to reach agreement. We also provide a huge amount of free resources, guides, tools and webinars such as this to help agents, landlords and tenants alike. So how do you comply? So you must comply within 30 calendar days from the 30 days of receipt of the deposit taken, and this applies to a short hold tenancies only. And you must also serve prescribed information, and that needs to be served on the tenant and also any relevant person, and that is defined as any person paying the deposit on the behalf of the tenant. And also they must be provided with a scheme leaflet. TDS does not police non-compliance of the TDP legislation, however. So what happens if it goes wrong? So if you haven't protected the deposit or you haven't served prescribed information, then the court you may be ordered to, you must return the deposit to the tenant, and the court may order a penalty between 1 and 3 times the deposit value, and also you will not be able to serve a Section 21 notice if you haven't protected the deposit, and the same applies in relation to prescribed information. It may be possible to serve prescribed information late, however you will not avoid the financial penalties. So just looking at dispute statistics, you can see here for 23-24, the majority of disputes raised with TDS, and this is in our insured scheme only, are raised by tenants and the balance by landlords or agents. And the main sort of part of claims made are cleaning, followed by damage, redecoration, rent arrears and gardening. That doesn't add up to 100% because it's very rare that we will just see a single claim being made for cleaning. So it's really key to get all of the information on your check-in and check-out reports. So I thought I'd first off just give you an idea of thinking like an adjudicator. From the point of view of the adjudicator, it's the tenant's deposit, it belongs to them, and if there is no evidence to support that deposit, then it must rightly be returned to the tenant. Now, the starting point, the onus is on the agent landlord or the party wishing to make a claim against the deposit to provide sufficient evidence to justify a claim. It is a documentary-based evidence process, and we take documents at face values. It is on the balance of probabilities, so it can be very finely balanced as to who has an award or not. And generally speaking, the adjudicator is not able to consider whether a clause or a claim is in breach of the unfair contract terms, but they will be looking at the reasonableness and fairness of a claim that's made. So what the adjudicator will do, they will look to see what the tenancy agreement says. They will then check that the tenancy agreement has a deposit use clause. Has there been a breach of a tenancy obligation? Is there evidence of the condition and cleanliness at check-in? Is there evidence of the condition and cleanliness at check-out? And in each claim, is each claim supported with documentary evidence? And then importantly, has the landlord suffered a financial loss? There must be a financial loss suffered by the landlord for the adjudicator to consider an award. They will then look to see that the most appropriate remedy is being sought, and then whether the amounts claimed are fair and reasonable, and whether the claims can be quantified. The remedies available to adjudicator is mainly making good, so it's cleaning or repair. Replacement will only ever be considered where the item is so severely and extensively damaged that it is beyond economic repair or its condition makes it unusable. And then compensation is where an item's value is reduced or its lifespan shortened. An award may be made for compensation. They will also have to consider in each and every claim fair wear and tear and betterment. So that's damage, depreciation, loss resulting from ordinary use. They will take into account the length of the tenancy, the number and ages and relationships of the tenants, the condition, age and cost of the item at the start of the tenancy, the reasonable usage of the item and the average useful lifespan. And they will ensure that any award that they make does not put the landlord or the agent in a better financial or material position than they were at the start of the tenancy. Effectively, it's not to be treated as a new for old insurance policy. So, bearing all of that in mind, it's really key that you have a decent tenancy agreement that does what you want it to do. You have a comprehensive signed inventory with photographs embedded, if possible, and that you always keep a written record of any agreements during the tenancy. That might be if you allow a tenant to redecorate or allow them to keep a pet, because that's when disputes may arise. In the same way that you need a comprehensive check-in, you'll need a detailed checkout report, and obviously keep receipts and invoices to not only demonstrate the cost of making good at the end of the tenancy, but in order to support any statements that you're making in your submission, because neither party is allowed to rely upon a statement alone as it's documentary-based evidence. So just a little bit more detail. Tenancy agreement is really setting out the rules of the game, the obligations for the landlord and the tenant. It should contain a well-drafted deposit use clause, sets out the liability in the event of breach, and also consider whether your clauses are fair and reasonable. Do also consider the Tenant Fees Act, which came in on the 1st of June 2019. The transitionary period has long since expired, but if you have an old tenancy agreement, then be aware that some of those clauses may be unenforceable. So looking at the check-in report, it is a comprehensive document detailing in writing the condition and standard of cleanliness. So condition and cleanliness are two very different things. It is effectively a baseline record that can be compared to the property state at the end of the tenancy, should you need to make a deposit deduction. It should list all fixtures, fittings and contents of the property along with the standard of cleanliness, e.g. dirt, grease, limescale, dust, and their condition to include any existing damage, notifying any marks, stains, chips, dents, signs of fair wear and tear. So I think this is where the smart fill feature comes into its own. Inventory should be carried out at a timely point, so it has to be as close to the start of the tenancy as possible. If it's taken a month in advance of the tenancy agreement, then it will become less reliable for adjudication purposes. And as Mitch said, ideally, we would recommend that it should be passed to the tenants on the date they move in, and then they should be provided with an opportunity to comment on its findings and notify if there are any discrepancies within the document itself. And once signed and or returned with comments, it is the tenant's agreement to the inventory on record, and so there are less likely to be disputes at the end of the tenancy with a well detailed check-in report. Looking now at the checkout report, you should always carry out the checkout report prior to completing any repair work. So don't go in and clean beforehand or carry out any odd jobs before you do your formal checkout report. Ideally, it's a good idea to inform tenants and allow tenants to be present, although that's not always possible. And as Mitch alluded to, this can help avert unexpected deposit deductions and gives the tenant a chance to put things right and or list any maintenance issues. Really good if you don't have a tenancy, a check-in report in the one document, to take along the check-in report and ensure that every aspect of the check-in list is covered. And photographs of any damage are really useful to support the written word. It's key, though, as Mitch mentioned, that a photograph isn't going to tell you that there's a smell or an odour in the property, and a photograph of a wall is not necessarily going to tell you that it is freshly painted. So whilst they absolutely support the check-in report or the checkout report, the written word is actually key as well. So it needs to say something like freshly painted or a smell of pet, something like that. So it should record with sufficient detail the cleanliness and condition at the tenancy end to identify what's changed. And again, the tenants should be sent a copy of the checkout as soon as possible and keep a record of sending it to them. And just bear in mind that tenants will not be responsible for fair wear and tear, which must be assessed on the length of the tenancy and the type of occupancy. So fair wear and tear or damage. So let's say, for example, the checkout report merely said scuffs on walls. Now, it may be that the adjudicator, without sufficient detail, would look to see the length of the tenancy, the number of occupants, the condition at the start of the tenancy of those walls. And they might consider that actually those scuffs on walls actually fall within the scope of fair wear and tear. However, if there was further detail within the checkout report and it said, for example, heavy tire-like scuffs in the hallway, so perhaps somebody's kept their bicycle in the hallway, then that is going to be sufficient detail for them to perhaps consider that those scuffs on walls actually exceed the scope of fair wear and tear for the length of the tenancy, and that an award is appropriate. Drawing on walls, I think we would all consider that that is just damage. Spots on carpets. So if a checkout just merely said spots on carpets, then that may not be sufficient detail to make an award, because spots do appear on carpets just as a matter of aging process, and it depends on what the condition was at the start and what the age of those carpets. But if it was sort of like nail varnish spots or hair dye spots, and there was a little bit more detail within the checkout report, then again that would actually lend itself towards damage as opposed to fair wear and tear. Shading and fraying to carpets. So shading does happen along the outsides of rooms, and carpets may just fray due to age. There may be the plate that's holding the carpets together that may be ill-fitted, and the carpet might just fray away. So the more detail, written detail that you can provide will assist in determining whether an award could be made. Fading to curtains and upholstery, I would say if that's sunlight damage, then that would be fair wear and tear. However, if there's fading due to they've been, or an area of the carpet has been scrubbed negligently and it's changed colour, then that could amount to damage. So it's the level of detail. Cracks in plaster. So again, if you just mention a crack in the wall, then that could just be a settlement crack. But it could also be something other than that, where perhaps a door has hit the plaster, the wall, and it's actually got a tiny little dent, and then there's sort of cracks coming out of that wall, out of that dent. So again, it's very much dependent upon the level of detail. Burns or marks on worktops. So if it just says marks on worktops, then again, those can be fair wear and tear, and we would again look at the length of the tenancy. But if it says sort of more details such as burns or significant gouges or significant knife marks on the worktop, then again that might assist with a claim an award in relation to damage. So generally speaking, the lack of sufficient detail and description of the areas and any items within a property and insufficient detail as to the cleanliness may impact the likelihood of success in claims made. So we'll look at a couple of case studies. So in this one, the landlord's claiming £120 for a full deep clean at the end of the tenancy, saying that the property was professionally cleaned at the start of the tenancy and dirty at the end. To support the claim, the landlord provided the tenancy agreement and 3 undated photographs of the bedroom, bathroom and living room at the end of the tenancy. So the tenant, in response, disputed the claim, stating that the property was not clean, particularly the kitchen at the start of the tenancy, and provided as evidence a copy of an email they sent to the agent landlord shortly after moving in which they complained about the standard of cleanliness. So in this particular case, the deposit, as we know, is taken for security against the non-performance of a tenant obligation. And any obligation, sorry, I can't quite read that. I might just have to put my glasses on. Sorry.
Allegation. allegation.
Yes. Oh, and any allegation of a breach of contract on the part of the landlord is outside the remit of the adjudication. The tenancy agreement contained a deposit use clause, which allowed the deposit to be used for the claim, and it also provided an obligation for the tenant to return the property to the same standard as at the start of the tenancy. However, in this case, due to the lack of a detailed written check-in and check-out report, the cleanliness of the property at the start and end of the tenancy was unknown. So you can't just rely upon a landlord's statement that the property was professionally cleaned at the start, particularly in this instance where a tenant actually disputes that and provides evidence of reporting that it wasn't clean. And the photographs at the end of the tenancy, whether they are dated or not, in this particular instance, it wasn't possible for a comparison to be made as to the level, if any, of deterioration in the standard of cleanliness from the start, because there was no comparable photographs from the start of the tenancy. And additionally, the 3 photographs that were provided were just of 3 rooms, not the entire property itself. So I think this is highlighting the need for, firstly, to have check-in and check-out reports, and secondly, the level of detail that's required within them. So this next case study is relating to damage. So £350 for the cost of replacing the carpet in one of the bedrooms, which had a visible burn mark at the end of the tenancy. The landlord says that the damage was very noticeable in the centre of the room. And to support the claim, the landlord provided the tenancy agreement, a comprehensive check-in report which states that the carpet in the bedroom was in good condition, other than furniture and dents, and a comprehensive check-out report, but that merely stated mark to carpet with no supporting photographs. They did provide also a quote for carpet replacement. The tenant admits to having caused the burn accidentally, but says that the mark was actually very minor and easily concealed by furniture or a rug. So in this particular case, the adjudicator decision was based on the fact that the lack of detail in the checkout report as to the size, location, and extent of the mark may have resulted in the adjudicator considering that the mark to be within the scope of fair wear and tear, because it just said mark to carpet, and obviously they would have taken into consideration the length of the tenancy. However, in this particular instance, thankfully, because of that lack of detail in the checkout report, the tenant actually admitted that the mark was a burn that they had caused accidentally. So that somewhat salvaged the situation. So there was no dispute over the damage, more so the extent of the damage caused. And due to the tenant's admission, the adjudicator was prepared to accept that the damage to the carpet was in fact a burn, but the award was limited due to the lack of detail in the description with no photographs provided. So again, I think that highlights how the outcome of a dispute and the amount awarded can be impacted due to the information or the lack of information and detail provided in your check-in and check-out reports. So obviously, just some stats here from us. So we are here when you need us. Call answering is 40 seconds, really quick. So you won't be hanging on waiting to hear from us. Our dispute resolution times back in September to March was 21 days. So again, a quick turnaround for those that do end up in dispute. Although we do work very hard to help early resolution and self-resolution, and we have very quick email answering times. So if you're not with TDS, do think about perhaps opening or registering a deposit with us.
Lovely stuff. Thank you very much, Sandy. I'll just stop sharing the screen, and then I will see if any questions have come in. Yes, I have got quite a few. First one is, 1 second. I need to open these up. What do you do with a deposit at the end of a tenancy after 6 years held where there's been no contact from either party? I hope that makes sense for you, Sandy.
Yes, yeah. So TDS, we have a charitable TDS charitable fund, and so any deposits that are not able to be returned to their rightful parties, then it will go into our TDS charitable fund, and that has the sole purpose of improving the PRS and sort of educational pieces and grants to companies within those that apply within the PRS. We do, however, have huge efforts made to return unallocated deposit funds before that period to the parties. So we really do reach out and look to find those tenants or landlords that are entitled to some of the deposit back.
Lovely stuff. Will the TDS accept a check-in inventory report even though it's not been signed by the tenant?
Yeah, so obviously best practice, I think, as we discussed, Mitch, is to give the a copy to the tenant, and hopefully they will sign and return it within the time frame that they're given, which is usually 7 days, sometimes less. But that's not always the case. So I think it's really, really useful to have an audit trail of actually sending the check-in report to the tenant, so that the adjudicator can see that they actually received it. And then if it's not signed, then the adjudicator will go with the best available evidence to them. And so if let's say, for example, a tenant is disputing the fact that that is the check-in report, then the tenant then needs to provide an alternative check-in report that the adjudicator prefers to the one that they've been provided. And if they aren't able to provide that, then the adjudicator will go with an unsigned check-in report or checkout report. And the other thing to just note there is, just because a tenant signs a checkout report doesn't mean to say that they are accepting the cost of all of the deductions of any proposed deductions. It's likely that they are acknowledging that there has been a change in some of the areas and items, but it doesn't mean to say that they necessarily are accepting any costs that are put forward to them at a later date.
Lovely stuff. I think this was on one of your slides, and I noticed this as well. It said, what do you mean by don't serve prescribed information early?
Ah, yes, sorry, I must not have seen that because it was so small.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have to serve prescribed information within 30 days of receipt of the deposit. So if you happen to serve prescribed information before you receive the deposit, then you are non-compliant. So it may be circumstances whereby you've got your tenancy agreement, you've got prescribed information attached to it at the back, you send it off to your tenant, they then sign it and they return it back to you. They then the next day give you the deposit, and then they move in. A couple of days later, you have effectively served the prescribed information before you receive the deposit. So early service of prescribed information is non-compliant. So just make sure it's within receipt of the deposit.
Nice stuff. It says here, what happens if you disagree with the tenant feedback on the moving report? For example, I've had a property professionally deep cleaned, so the cleanliness is of an excellent standard, but the tenant is trying to state that it's only fair. I suppose that when tenants do feedback on reports, obviously, when it does come back to you, you can see by the photographic evidence that the tenant's provided if you agree with them or not. If you don't agree with that, then obviously you've got evidence that it's been professionally cleaned by either an invoice, by a professional contractor, or anything else that you can support alongside that check-in inventory report. So if you disagree with the tenant's comments and you've got further evidence of that professional clean taking place, then I assume that can get submitted alongside the check-in inventory if the tenant disagrees with that. Would you say that's the case, Sandy, as well?
Yes, absolutely. So it might be the case that there's different sort of standards of cleanliness, and a tenant might think it's not clean when it has been professionally cleaned. And I think this is really key as well in your check-in reports, that obviously you can have a summary which says that the property has been professionally cleaned, But the body of the report needs to have sufficient detail to confirm that throughout in relation to each particular room, because there may be some oversights of that professional clean. There may be a couple of smears on a window, or dust on the skirting board that a professional cleaner has missed. And then you can either acknowledge those, or, as you say, Mitch, you can disagree and perhaps offer to do a further inspection so you can see whether or not there are justifiable discrepancies.
I am based in Scotland, and it's drummed into us that the written word is far more powerful evidence than photos. Is it slightly different in England? So I know in the TDS, obviously, it's safe deposits.
Yeah, Safe Deposit Scotland.
Scotland,
Yeah,
yeah. So, yeah, is it? I assume is it the same standard in both countries?
Yeah, we provide obviously the adjudication services for Safe Deposit Scotland, and it is really the written word is key. As I mentioned in the presentation, photographs are really useful, particularly in highlighting areas of damage. But a photograph isn't going to tell you whether something is freshly painted or whether there's an odour. So it's really key that the written word and the level of detail is essential, and I think, which is why SmartFill, I think, is providing that level of detail, provided it's checked and it's correct, and the tenant has an opportunity to have a look at it and comment. But photographs are useful to supplement the written word, absolutely.
How much does it cost to use the TDS?
So that would depend whether you're an agent or a landlord. And also obviously free if you're using the custodial service, but if you're insured, then you would need to be regulated, and that information is all on our website. Or alternatively, if we can have details, I can come back to you after these.
That's all the questions, and we've run out of time, unfortunately. So, yeah, I appreciate everyone that's come to today's webinar. A recording of the webinar will be emailed out to you automatically in the next couple of hours. So keep an eye out for that if you want to revisit that, or those that couldn't make it. If you've got any colleagues that couldn't make it for whatever reason, they'll get a recording emailed to them as well. And thank you very much, Sandy. Appreciate your time as always. Very informative, and we look forward to doing more of these in the future. Any further questions, do not hesitate to ask. And yeah, thanks for everyone's time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers, Sandy. Bye.
Bye.